Okay, 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock. Let's get settled in for some Latin studies here. Sorry, I'm a couple minutes late. I had a kamikaze fly bothering me, and I had to exterminate him before we got started here. So I think we're okay now. All right, so 1 o'clock Friday. We're gonna do some Latin study here. So let's just make sure everybody gets settled in. A few kids still coming in. We've been studying the grammar of Latin, and I want to keep studying grammar because I know that most students have no problem with Latin vocabulary. That's kind of easy. And most students have no problem with Latin reading. There's a bunch of kids right now finishing up the Latin reading course, the first Latin reading, getting into Latin reading too. So I really don't need to help too much with Latin reading, but the course that everything really depends on and that students don't like to study is Latin grammar. So I want to try to make Latin grammar as easy as possible so you guys can get through Latin grammar, because that's really the most important course. If you don't know Latin grammar, you really can't understand Latin. So I want to do the work of helping you guys through Latin grammar. And what I'd like you to do, what I'd like to make sure you do, just like with Aesop's fables, when we go over a lesson together in our live class, I want you to try to give attention to that lesson in the Latin grammar course and try to get it done, so we can sort of move through Latin grammar together, and we'll work through it week by week. And as you do that, you'll really start to understand the language. And then maybe in the future we can get into conversational Latin, which can be kind of fun. If you're a nerd. I mean, if you're not a nerd, these kinds of things aren't interesting. But if you're a nerd like me, then conversational Latin can be fun. So we can have maybe special weeks where it's sort of like nerds only, and the cool people aren't allowed to come because we're going to get into some nerdy stuff. So we'll see how things go. But what's most important is Latin grammar, because it really explains what's going on in the language. And if you don't understand that, you never really know what's going on, and you just are memorizing stuff, and that's really boring. That's really not learning. So what I'd like to do today, let me share my screen here and we'll get started. Let me just make sure I'm all set. Okay. All right, you should see, just give me a nod yes if you see a Latin grammar lesson on your screen. Yes? Okay, good. So we've been going through lesson 3 in Latin grammar. And again, I want to stress that as we go through these lessons and we talk about them and they're kind of easy to understand, go complete these lessons. Get these lessons finished, get the assignments turned in, take the quizzes, get this stuff done, because I think that's the easiest way to get through Latin grammar. So we're working through lesson 3 here, and as we get through it, we'll try to get it finished when we actually finish talking about it. So we've talked about the parts of speech in Latin. We said that there are 8 parts of speech. So all the different words in Latin, we can identify 8 parts of speech. And you should be working on your ability to look at a word in Latin and say, okay, that's a noun, that's a verb, that's a participle, that's a conjunction, and so on. That's the first skill that you need, just to be able to identify the parts of speech. Once you get pretty good at that, now there's another level that we're going to start looking at. And we can identify the parts of speech, but who cares, right? If you can identify the parts of speech, you're not going to win any awards, or there's no job application out there where they're going to ask you, like, can you name the 8 parts of speech? Okay. That's just step 1. So step 2 is, when we can identify the parts of speech, now we want to start to learn about the individual parts of speech. We want to learn all the characteristics of a noun. So if we can identify a noun, we can then start thinking about its characteristics. The same for a verb and a pronoun and so on. So we want to start learning about the characteristics of the parts of speech. And we said in last week's lesson that these characteristics are called the accidents, or things that happen to the parts of speech. All right. So last week we looked at 10 different things. Let me zoom in a little bit here. We looked at 10 different things. We said there are 10 things which accompany the parts of speech, and we listed them: number, case, gender, declension, conjugation, mood, tense, person, figure. So as of right now, you should know the names of these 10 things. I don't think that you understand what they are or what they mean, but you should simply know that there are 8 parts of speech, and then there are certain things which accompany or which happen to the parts of speech. And these 10 things, I actually only highlighted 9 of them. There are 10 of them. These 10 things are called the accidents of the parts of speech. And these are the qualities or the characteristics that we're going to start learning about all of these different parts of speech. All right, so we talked about them generally last week. We just sort of went through the list. I think I described them just a little bit for each one. But today we're going to sort of start to dig into these characteristics and understand them a little bit more. So we're going to look at the first 2. The first one is very simple. You all probably already understand it. If you've had any grammar, it's very simple. It's just number. And we learned that numbers are singular and plural. That's pretty simple, right? We know that there are singular numbers and plural numbers for nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. So we have singular and plural number. That's pretty simple. So the first thing that you need to know is when you identify a part of speech, if it's a noun or a pronoun or a verb or a participle, the first 4 parts of speech, if it's one of them, the first characteristic that you want to look for is number. The first characteristic is the number. You should want to tell if it's singular or plural. So once we can identify a part of speech, we can look at a word and say, that's a noun. As soon as we identify the part of speech and we know it's noun, pronoun, verb, or participle, the first thing we should ask is, what's the number of this word? What is the number? Is it singular or is it plural? So that's very simple, okay? And we know that by looking at the different forms. And what we're going to study in Latin grammar, if you look at the Latin grammar course, starting at lesson, I don't know, 4, I think it is, just so you see the way that this course is organized. In lesson 4, we study the noun. So we learn about the characteristics of nouns starting in lesson 4. Right now, we're talking about lesson 3. But in lesson 4, we're going to start focusing on nouns. Then as we go down here, we're going to go through different characteristics of nouns, 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 all the way down through these lessons: 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. We keep going: nouns, 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 more nouns, until lesson 29. And then in lesson 29, we move on to the second part of speech, which is the pronoun. So there's 24 or 25 lessons on the characteristics of nouns. Obviously, they're very important. Then we get into pronouns. And so you've got a couple lessons on pronouns: lesson 29, 30, 31, 32, down to lesson 35. Lesson 35, we start studying all the different characteristics of verbs. And then we've got a ton of lessons on verbs, because verbs are obviously very important. We go through all these verb lessons, learning all the different forms of verbs, all the different characteristics of verbs. And we keep going and going and going until lesson 83. Lesson 83, we move on to the next part of speech, which is the participle. And then after that, it goes really fast, because remember, the last 4 parts of speech don't have any forms. So we go from the first 83 lessons on the first 4 parts of speech, and then we just knock out the last 4: preposition, adverb, interjection, and conjunction. And then we're pretty much done with Latin Grammar 1. So all Latin Grammar 1 is a study of the characteristics of the 8 parts of speech. That's all that it is. We simply go through all the 8 parts of speech and learn all their characteristics. So once you understand what we're actually doing in Latin grammar, it makes it a lot easier to get going with the study. It's not, you're not walking into some maze, some ocean of information. It's actually pretty easy to understand what we're doing. So anyway, back to lesson 4, we see we get started with nouns. So we're going to study nouns first. But in lesson 3, we have an introduction to all of the different qualities of the parts of speech that we need to learn, okay? So the first one we focus on is number. So if we see a noun, a pronoun, a verb, or a participle, the first question we should ask when we look at that word is, what is the number? Is it singular or is it plural? And that helps us to begin the translation process. Okay, the first question is singular or plural. Then we go on to the second item, which is what I want to talk about today, which are the cases. In Rule 14 here in Lesson 3, the second characteristic or the second accident of the parts of speech is case. And there's only 3 parts of speech that have case, and they're listed here: nouns, participles, and pronouns. So the first question, if it's a noun, a pronoun, a verb, or a participle, the first question is, what is the number? If it's a noun, a pronoun, or a participle, the second question is, what case is the word in? What case? And so we have to know the cases of nouns, pronouns, and participles. And they're the same for all 3 of those. So nouns have 6 cases, pronouns have 6 cases, participles have 6 cases, and the cases are the same. So once we learn what the cases are, it's the same for nouns, pronouns, and participles. We have to learn, though, what these cases are, and then we have to learn how to identify these cases. That's the challenging part. That's why we study nouns for like 20 or 30 lessons, okay? Because we have to learn how to identify these forms. So what I want to do today, and I don't know if you've had any Latin studies before or not, even if you did, they might not have been very good. So I just want to make sure that we understand these things accurately and clearly. So what I'd like to do is talk about the 6 cases, and I'd like to make this as helpful as possible for you. Just a minute. So I want to talk about the 6 cases here in nouns, participles, and pronouns. We see the names of the 6 cases here, the names of the 6 cases: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, and ablative. And if you're just getting started with Latin, you've probably never heard these words before. And that's a good thing. It's good. It's actually better when students don't know anything, because they can learn the truth about things right from the beginning, and it actually makes it easier. If you've kind of heard things about the cases in the past, you may bring all sorts of wacky ideas into your Latin studies, and they may end up confusing you. So it's actually better. I would rather have a student come in who doesn't know anything than a student who's picked up all kinds of wacky ideas from different books or different classes, different teachers, and so on. I'd like to keep it simple. So there are 6 cases which we have to learn, and you've got to memorize the names of these 6 cases. And you've got to memorize them in this order, because the order is actually important: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, and ablative. 6 cases. And you've got to memorize them in that order, because we're going to memorize the different forms, and they're always going to be in the same order. And that's going to actually help you to memorize and remember them. So there are 6 cases: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, and ablative. These cases don't exist in English. Not all of these cases exist in Greek. So these 6 cases really make Latin to be Latin, these 6 cases. Now, what are the cases? That's the next question we should ask. What are cases? Cases are simply different forms of these parts of speech, of nouns, participles, and pronouns. different forms that explain how one noun relates to the other parts of the sentence. The cases tell us what that one noun is doing in the sentence. So the cases help us with translation because they tell us what the different nouns are doing in a sentence. In English, we don't use cases, we use phrases, we use prepositions and things like that. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But the cases are different forms of nouns, pronouns, and participles that show us what those words are doing in the sentences and how we need to translate them into English. So they're the keys for us to guide us to translate these Latin words correctly into English. We've got to be able to look at words, to look at nouns, to look at pronouns, to look at participles, and identify the case of that noun or that participle or pronoun, because that tells us how to translate it, okay? The first case here, and you might want to just jot some stuff down as we go through this. Again, it'll be recorded, but you still might want to just jot some scratchy notes down. The first case is the nominative case. And I may have talked about this before, but the nominative case is the simple name of a thing. So if I just say your name, like I see Cecilia, Gianna, Samuel, Zachary, if I just look at you and say your name and just state your name, that's the nominative case. It just means the naming case. All right. So the nominative case is just the basic form of the noun itself. And remember, noun just means name. So the basic name form is called the nominative case. All right, that's the simple form. So if you take a dictionary, you grab a Latin dictionary and you look up a noun or you look up a pronoun or a part, what you're looking for is the nominative case of that word. That's what's in the dictionary, the nominative case, the basic name form for those parts of speech, okay? That's the nominative, basic name form. The second form is a genitive case. The second form is the genitive. So the form of the noun or the pronoun or the participle, the form will change and show that that noun is being used to show possession. So it's like a possessive case in English grammar. The genitive case shows possession. So in English, we don't have a genitive case. We use the preposition of. So I could say, this is the city of Achilles. Okay, this is the city of Aristotle. This is the country of Plato. So if I say of Plato in English, I use two words, a preposition and a noun. But in Latin, I don't do that. In Latin, I just use the genitive case of the name Plato, and the genitive case means of Plato. So that meaning is built into that form of that word. It's only one word in Latin, but when I translate it, I have to know that because in English, it's going to be translated with two words. Okay, so that's why I have to understand the case in order to make the translation. So the genitive case shows possession. The nominative case is the simple name form. So if you were just going to point at something and say the name of it, you would use the nominative form of that word. If you want to express possession, then you would use the genitive case form. And we're going to look at some examples in a little bit. If you want to show possession, you use the genitive case for that noun. The third case is the dative case. The third case is the dative. It's pronounced dative. And the dative case is another form of a noun that shows that it's an indirect object. And I'll explain what that means. The dative case shows that a noun is an indirect object of a verb, an indirect object. And you may not know what an indirect object is, but you use them every day because it's very simple, okay? And I'll give you an example here. All right, if I say I write, let's say a letter, I write a letter to Cecilia. I write a letter to Cecilia. The verb is write. The subject is I. That would be in the nominative case because it's just a simple name. It's the noun, the subject. Then we have the verb write. And then the question is, what do we write? That's the direct object of the verb. That's the direct object. What we write a letter. That's a direct object. But then we have an indirect object too. I write a letter to Cecilia. So Cecilia is also an object of the verb, but she's an indirect object because I don't write Cecilia, I write a letter. That's what I actually write. That's the direct object of the verb. That's what I actually do. I write a letter. But I write a letter to Cecilia. And so Cecilia is also affected by my writing, but she's affected in an indirect way. So she's the indirect object, okay? So in English, we express the indirect object. We use this every single day, all the time. We express it with prepositions. We use two words. We say, I write a letter to Cecilia. So we use the word to, which is a preposition. I write a letter to Cecilia. That phrase, to Cecilia, expresses the indirect object. In Latin, it's just one word. You just take the noun and put it into the dative case form, and it expresses that idea, which in English requires two words. In Latin, there's only one word in the dative case, all right? So one translation of the dative case is the preposition to. I write a letter to Cecilia. That's one translation of the dative, but there's another one. Another one is for. So I could say, I bought a gift. That's the direct object. I bought a gift for Samuel. So I bought a gift. What did I do? I bought something. What did I buy? I bought a gift. That's the direct object. That's what I actually bought. But there's an indirect object, some other object that's affected by my action, but it's affected in an indirect way. I bought a gift. That's the direct object. I bought a gift for Samuel. Samuel is the indirect object. In English, we use two words. We say for Samuel. We express that idea with two words. In Latin, we use one word, and we use a different form of that word. We use the dative case or the dative form of that noun. So I would take Samuel's name and I would turn it into the dative case form, and then anyone who read that or heard that in Latin would know that that means that Samuel is the indirect object of the verb. So they do that with a case, with a different form. So far we've got the nominative case, which simply names a noun. We've got the genitive case, which shows that the person or thing that's named possesses something. And then we've got the dative case, which identifies an indirect object. Okay, so three cases so far. The fourth case is the accusative case. And this is very easy to understand now. The accusative case shows that a noun or a pronoun or a participle is the direct object of a verb. The accusative case shows a direct object. So to use those examples I already gave, I wrote a letter to Cecilia. I wrote a letter. Letter is the direct object. In English, we usually use just one word to express the direct object. It's simple. But in English, what we do is we use word order to show that this word is the subject and this word is the direct object. In English, we use word order to show what the subject is and what the direct object is. So we put the subject first, then we put the verb, and then we put the direct object. That's the only way that we know what the subject and the direct object are. We can't move words around in English or the sentences will make no sense. When we speak, we start by naming the subject, then we name the verb, and then we name the direct object. I wrote a letter. I bought a gift. That's how English works. If we change the word order around, the sentence no longer makes any sense. We can't say, a letter wrote I. We can say that, and if you're smart and understand grammar, you can still understand what's being said because you know that the word I is in the nominative case. And so you know that that's still the subject, even though the words were moved around. But that's not how we normally talk. So in English, the way that we show the nominative and the accusative is by the order of the words. The nominative comes before the verb, the accusative comes after the verb. The subject is the nominative, the direct object is the accusative. In Latin, they have different forms. And why that's important is because in Latin, you can move the words around and still understand the sentence because you see that the forms or the cases tell you what the different words are doing in the sentence. So that's why in Latin, words can move around a little more freely than in English because the meaning of the sentence doesn't depend on the order of the words. So the accusative case, the fourth case here, the accusative case shows that a noun or a pronoun or a participle is a direct object of a verb. And the dative case shows that it's an indirect object. Okay, so think of those examples I gave you. I wrote a letter to Cecilia. I is the subject in the nominative case. The letter is the direct object. To Cecilia is the indirect object. I bought a gift for Samuel. A gift is the direct object. For Samuel, those two words together express the indirect object. Okay, in Latin, they're just different forms of individual words. So we've got four so far: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. The next one, case number 5, is vocative. The vocative case. The vocative case sometimes, not always, but sometimes there's a different form for the vocative case. Most of the time, the nominative and the vocative are the same. So if you call someone, that's what the vocative is used for. If you speak to someone or something, and you speak their name as if you're talking to them or writing to them directly, so you're addressing them. If I say, hey, Zachary, and I say Zachary's name, but I'm not saying Zachary as a subject, I'm actually addressing and talking to Zachary. For some nouns will have a different form when the person or thing is being spoken to directly. That's the vocative case. Most of the time it's the same form, but sometimes there's a different form, and I'll give you an example. In sacred scripture, the word for the Lord, the noun is what? Do any of you know what the name for the Lord is in Latin? What's the Lord? Latin. What's the Lord in Latin? Okay, you're kind of getting close, but still nobody's there yet. Nope. Deus means God. What is the Lord? There we go. James Bates got it. Dominus. Dominus is the Lord. Dominus. That's the nominative case. Okay, that's the nominative case. It means the Lord. Now, some of you wrote other forms of that noun. I see Domini, was written and domine was written. Those are two different cases. And the reason why I wanted to use dominus is because the nominative and the vocative are different for dominus. So if I was talking about the Lord, I would use dominus, okay? If I say the Lord created the earth, I would say dominus, that's the nominative case, the subject, dominus creavit, that means he created. And then I would say terram, the earth. That's the accusative form of the noun terra, which means earth. Dominus creavit terram, okay? But if I wanted to pray to the Lord, if I wanted to pray, or if I was reading a prayer, I'm not talking about the Lord and just naming him. I'm actually addressing him directly. I would not use dominus. I wouldn't pray and say, "Oh, dominus." That wouldn't be right, because dominus is the nominative case, but it has a different form for the vocative case. So if I was going to pray, I would say domine, domine. And you'll see that if you go to a church that celebrates Latin Mass, or if there's prayers in Latin, or maybe some of you might say the rosary in Latin or something like that, you'll notice that when you pray to the Lord in Latin, you don't use dominus, you use domine, because that's the vocative case form of the noun dominus. So that's what the vocative case is for. When something is spoken to or written to directly, the vocative case or the vocative form of the noun is used. But for most nouns, just so you know, for most nouns, the nominative and the vocative are the same. So you wouldn't make any difference. But for some nouns, they're different, and we have to learn that, okay? So we've got the nominative case first. That's the simple form of the name. Simple form of a noun, a pronoun, or a participle. We can look them up in the dictionary. The second form is the genitive case. That shows possession. The third form is the dative case. That shows an indirect object. The fourth case is the accusative. That shows a direct object. The fifth case is the vocative. It shows that someone or something is being spoken to directly, okay? And then lastly, the last or sixth case is called the ablative. Ablative, and it's pronounced ablative. Sometimes when kids get started in Latin, they say ablative. It's not ablative, it's ablative. That's how you pronounce that word, ablative, okay? The ablative is complicated because the ablative case is used to express all different kinds of ideas, all right? Usually, the ideas that are expressed with the ablative case have prepositions with them, and I'll show you some examples of these in a minute. But the ablative case can express all kinds of different ideas. It can express the place where something is from. It can explain the place where something is at. It can explain the time when something took place. So there's lots and lots of different ideas that are expressed by the ablative case. And here's what you should think about. If something is not the nominative, the genitive, the dative, the accusative, or the vocative, everything else is just the ablative case, okay? So the ablative case is always the most difficult to translate because there's no way to know how the ablative case should be translated because there's 20 different options, okay? So the ablative case is difficult to translate. Usually, we have to establish all of the other parts of the translation and then translate the ablative case last, because we'll have an idea of what the sentence is saying, and then we can figure out what exactly the ablative case is being used for. Other times there will be prepositions with the ablative case that will show us the translation. But the ablative case is hard to translate because it's got a lot of possible options, all right? And I'll show you some examples. So we've got 6 cases, and what I want you to learn today, I want you to learn the names of each of the 6 cases, and I want you to know the function of each of the 6 cases. What excuse me, what does each of the 6 cases express or signify? Okay, that's what you need to understand, because we're learning a method for translating and reading Latin now. The first thing we want to know is, what is the part of speech? That's the first challenge. Once we know that it's a noun, a pronoun, a verb, or a participle, what's the second question we want to ask? What's the second question I said we ask? What's the second question? First, what part of speech is it? If we identify that it's a noun, a pronoun, a verb, or a participle, what's the second question we ask? Right, good, Huck. Good, James. What is the number? Is it singular or plural? That's the second thing we ask. And again, we'll know that because the words have different forms for singular and plural. Once we know what the number is, if it's a noun, a pronoun, or a participle, what's the next question that we should ask to translate? What's the next question? Case. Very good, Gianna. Okay, so we want to know the case third, and we know that there are 6 possible cases. And once we can identify the case by its form, then we know how to translate it. And so we can start to move forward in our translation. And we have to learn this process for how to go about translating Latin. Okay, so there are 6 cases, and each of the 6 cases has a different idea that it's used to express. So here's a quick quiz. Ready? Which of the cases, let's see who's paying attention, which of the cases expresses the direct object of a verb? Direct object. Which case expresses the direct object? Accusative. Good. Which case is used to give the simple name of a noun? Which is the simple name? Which case? Nominative. Good. Which case shows possession? Which case shows possession? Genitive case. Very good. Genitive case. Which case is used when we speak to someone or something directly? Which case is used for direct speech, direct address? Vocative. And then lastly, let's see who can answer this. Why is the ablative difficult to translate? Why is the ablative case difficult to translate? You can just write in short terms, no complete sentences. Good, Cecilia, that's right. Huck, that's right. Just kind of everything else, it's like an extra bucket that everything else gets shoved into, right? That's right. All right, good. So the ablative case can express a bunch of different ideas. That's why it's the most difficult to translate. So good. So we see that there are 6 cases. Most of you have a good idea of what they mean and what they are. Let me give you some help with remembering this, all right? Because we don't have to just memorize it like dum-dums. We can look at these names and get an idea of what each of them is, okay? The nominative case, if you look at the word, it has nomen in it, and that just means name. So the nominative case is the simple name form. That's easy to remember. Nominative case, the name case, okay? Genitive case. If we look at the beginning of the word genitive, we see the beginning is gen, and we can think of generation, the word generation, or the source of where a thing comes from, right? The possession, the source, whose it is. So we can think of the genitive case and think of the generation or the genus of a thing, okay? So we can think of genitive. Dative is pretty easy because in Latin, if you study Latin reading, what does the word data est? What does the word data mean? Data. You should know that if you're in Latin reading. What does data mean? Data. Let's be exact. Gave is exact. Good. Gave. It means to give. All right. So the verb that data comes from means to give. So the dative case is the case, the indirect object. I give a gift to Samuel, right? That's the dative case. It's the giving case. the case of giving to or doing something for someone. So you can remember data means to give. That's the indirect object. Then we've got the accusative case. This one's a little more difficult because when we think of the word accuse in English, we usually think that someone is claiming that someone else committed a crime, like I accuse you of stealing my sandwich, right? We think of accusing people, but that's really not what accuse means. Accuse just means to assert something of something else, okay? It just means to assert, to predicate something, all right? So I wrote a letter. What did I write? I wrote a letter, okay? It's simply the case where we assert something about some object, okay? Or we assert an object or something about a subject, sorry. Then we've got the vocative. We've got the vocative, and the first part of this word vocative, voc. What does the Latin word vox mean? V-O-X. Does anyone know what vox means? Voice, that's right, it means voice. What does the Latin vocatus mean? Vocatus. Does anyone know what vocatus means? Vocatus. Call, that's good. It's past tense, so called, right? The verb vocare, vocare means to call. So if you call someone and you're speaking to someone and you call their name, you use the vocative case, the calling case. Okay, so that's easy to remember. And then the ablative case, ablat. Who knows what the Latin word ab means? What does ab mean? A-B. What does ab mean? That's good, Gianna. It means away from or from, right? Does not mean to. That's A-D, ad. Ad means to. Ab means from. Good, 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 good. From. And then we have the second part here is lat. Latus. Does anyone know what latus means? Latus. Ab latus. No, not Latin. It means from the place or the side. Think of like latitude line or lateral, okay? It means a place or something besides something. So ablative case has the idea of place from where. That's the general idea of the ablative, the place from where. So as your Latin knowledge gets better, you'll be able to look at these words and realize what they mean. Nominative, nomen, name. Genitive, genus, origin or source. Dative, data, given or indirect object. Accusative or predicated, that's the direct object. Vocative from vocare, that's to call. That's the case used to call someone. Ablative, that means the place from where. That's the case that's used to express lots of different ideas with prepositions. So in time, you won't have to remember those things by memory. You'll be able to look at those words and realize what they mean, and it'll be easy for you to use those names. So that's all for the names. We've got like 10 minutes left. Let's look at some examples, okay? Let's look at some examples. So I'm going to open Latin reading. This is just lesson 1. So very simple. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify some nouns, some pronouns, and maybe some participles. There is at least, yeah, I see 2 participles in here. So we're going to look at some nouns, pronouns, and participles, and we're going to identify 2 things. What's the first thing we're going to identify? What's the first thing we're going to identify? Number. Good, number. Number is the first thing we're going to identify. And then after we identify the number, what's the second thing we're going to identify? The case. Good. Okay. So looking at verses 1 through 5, look at verses 1 through 5. Who can point out for us one noun? Who can point out a noun? Deum. Good. Stop there. Let's take Samuel's first. So Samuel said, Deum is a noun. Okay. So we see a noun here, deum, and what you can see is that it's got a certain form because right after it is deus, which has a different form. Okay. Now, in your Latin grammar lessons, you're going to learn all of these different forms. So you'd be able to look at that form and know exactly what it is. You don't necessarily know that now, and it's not a big deal. But when you study Latin grammar, when you get to the different cases of the nouns, you're going to memorize and learn all these different forms. So it's going to be very easy. But we can see there's two different forms. Samuel's right, saying that this is a noun. Deum is a noun. Deus is also a noun, two different forms. Here's the difference. Deus is the nominative case. So that's the simple name for God, Deus. That's the nominative case form. Deum is not the nominative case form. Deum is the accusative case form. Deum is the accusative case. And the accusative case is usually used to show what? What does the accusative case usually show? The accusative case. Direct object, direct object. Okay, so normally the accusative case shows the direct object. In this first sentence, something is different though. We have a preposition that comes before a noun, and this preposition, if you look it up in a dictionary, will tell you it must be followed by an accusative case. All right? If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll learn that apud has to be followed by an accusative case. That's why deum is in the accusative case. So this is an example of an accusative case noun form. Deus is an example of a nominative case noun form. All right, so there's two good examples to get us started. Who can find another one, another noun in this passage? Where's another noun at? Where's another noun? Verbum. Good. Verbum is another noun. We see verbum here, verbum here, verbum here. Lots of verbums in here. So we see verbum, and if we study the forms of nouns, we'll learn that the form verbum can actually be nominative or vocative or accusative. So it's actually the same form for three different cases. So we don't know which case it is just by looking at that form. We would have to use the other words of the sentence to figure that one out, because when we learn the word verbum, we would learn that the nominative, the accusative, and the vocative could all be verbum. So that doesn't necessarily help us, but it's any one of those three cases. And we'll learn that in our Latin grammar lessons. Let's find another noun in this passage here. Hominum, good. Down here in verse 4, we've got hominum. Now, when you look at hominum, let's look back at deum. Deum ends in um, and we said it was an accusative case. And then we see hominum, and it ends in so it looks like maybe this is an accusative case too, but it's not. It's a genitive case, all right? It's a genitive case, and let me ask you this. Those of you who know the translation, is hominum, and think before you answer, is hominum singular or plural? Singular or plural? Hominum. Think about the translation. Is it singular or plural? Very good, it's plural, okay? Is deum singular or plural? Singular or plural? Deum. Think about the translation. Singular or plural? Very good, it's singular. So they're not the same form. Even though they look the same, we see the ending. There's more to it than that. It's more complicated than that, okay? Deum is an accusative case, and it's singular. That's why it has that form. Hominum is plural, and it comes from a different set of nouns than deum. And in that set of nouns, this ending is the genitive case. So it's the genitive plural. And how is it translated? How do we translate hominum? How do we translate hominum? Of men. Now look at that translation. Do you see that it's possessive case? It's possessive, right? Of men. In English, there are two words. We have to use two words to translate hominum. But in Latin, it's just one word because the word of is built into that case ending. And it tells us to translate it of men, even though the word of is not there in the Latin. That's in the case. That's why the cases are important. We know that it's men, plural, because of the form, and we'll learn it later. We know it's plural, and we know that it's genitive, so it's possessive, and that shows us to translate it of, possessive, men, plural, okay? All of that information is in the form of the noun. Let's look at another one. I'll pick one here. Principio. Principio. You can see that principio follows a preposition. Over here, we learned that some prepositions require accusative cases after them. This preposition here has an ablative case after it. It has an ablative case after it. So principio is in the ablative case. So it can have a bunch of different meanings, and you've learned that, right? You've learned that this preposition in, the preposition in, can have a bunch of different meanings, right? Just like the ablative case. So we can see that's not so easy. If there are a bunch of different possible meanings, how can we figure out how to translate it? If there are a bunch of different possible meanings, how can we figure out how to translate it? Who can answer that? How can we figure out the translation if there's a bunch of different possible meanings? How can we figure it out? Who can tell me? The context, very good. The context, that means we have to look at the rest of the words of the sentence, and we have to start translating the things that are the most clear, and then use what we learn to help us translate the rest that isn't so clear. Okay, so good. So we can start to identify some nouns, and then as soon as we identify the noun, we can then ask, what is the number of the noun and what is the case of the noun? And that begins to tell us how to translate it into English. Good. Who can identify a pronoun in these 5 verses? Who can identify a pronoun in Latin? Where's a pronoun? Ipso, good. Okay, verse 4, verse 3, we have ipso, ipso. Here we see that ipso follows a preposition. So we have sine ipso. If you look up sine in a Latin dictionary, it will tell you that it needs to be followed by an ablative case. So ipso is an example of a pronoun in the ablative case. And the reason why it's in the ablative case is because it follows the preposition sine. So that's an easy one. Down in verse 4, we have the same pronoun, but we have a different preposition before it. We have in ipso. So again, we have the same idea. It's a preposition followed by an ablative case, but we'll have a different translation because we have a different preposition. So sine ipso, what does that mean? What does sine ipso mean? If you've been studying Latin reading, what does sine ipso mean? Very good. Without him, very good. Okay, that's what sine ipso means. What does in ipso mean? In ipso. In him, very good. Okay, in him. So the translation would be changed by the preposition. But both of those words, ipso in the first sentence and ipso in the second, they're both in the ablative case. Good. Who can find a participle in this passage? Who can find a participle? There's only, well, there's 2 different forms, but only one participle, 2 different forms. Who can find a participle? Erat is not a participle. That's not right. Quod is not a participle. No more guessing. Who can find a participle? We have to remember what a participle is. It's a part of speech that has different forms. It has cases and it expresses time. So looking at those words, comprehenderunt is a verb. All right, comprehenderunt expresses time, but it doesn't have different cases. It doesn't have nominative case, genitive case. So you don't know to identify. Let me stop you there. Okay, good. Jezreel. I don't know if that's Jezreel or or your brother who's answering that, but that's right. Factum is an example of a participle. So here we have factum. And here we have another form of that same participle, facta. So facta and factum are participles. What's the first question we should ask when we look at them? Let's look at facta. Is it singular or plural, right? Very good. Number. Is facta singular or plural? Who knows? Singular or plural? Facta. Think of the translation if you know it. Don't guess. I can tell when you're guessing because you answer very quickly, and you'd have to think in order to figure it out. Facta sunt. We already know the translation if you've studied Latin reading. How is it translated? It's plural because the verb that comes after it, what does sunt mean? What does sunt mean? Are. It's plural. They are. So facta means made, they are. So facta is plural. That's why the verb is plural. If we look over here, we have factum est. How do we translate est? Is. Very good. It's translated is. Is the verb is that singular or plural? Is. Singular or plural? Guessing, guessing, guessing. It's singular. Is singular. Okay, so factum is also singular. Factum here, we have factum est nihil. Factum is in the nominative case. It's singular and the nominative. Here we have facta, again in the nominative case, but it's plural, so it has a different ending. Facta, plural nominative. Factum, singular nominative. So what I want you to see today, and this is all that I want you to see. I don't expect you to know all this yet. So if you're struggling to answer the questions, don't think that, there's something wrong with your brain. You don't need to take any medicine or go to the hospital or anything like that. We're just getting started. What I want you to see, I want you to start to see that when I give you the translation for this passage, there's reasons for the translation. There are reasons for the translation. And the reasons are built into the forms, or I should say, the reasons come from the forms of these words. I don't just make it up. There's not like a little spirit that comes and sits on my shoulder and whispers the answers into my ears. I look at the words and I use my knowledge of the grammar to look at the forms and use the forms to tell me how to translate the Latin into English. So all that I want you to see at this point is for nouns, pronouns, and participles. The different forms are different cases, and the cases tell us different things about what those words are doing in the sentences. And we use our knowledge of the cases to translate those words into English, which often requires us to use a couple of different words because we don't use cases in English, okay? So the first question we ask is, what's the number? The second, what are the cases? You should know the names of the 6 cases and have a good idea of what they're used for. If you can come away from this lesson knowing that, and again, that's a lot to take in during one lesson. If you can come away knowing that there are 6 cases and have a good idea of the names of those cases and what they're for, you're doing well. You can watch this video again, so I'm not worried about that. But today's lesson, the topic is number and case. And let me ask you, do you feel like you have a good sense of that, or are you totally confused? What do you think? Easy, pretty easy, very difficult? What do you think? What do you think? Easy, not really, easy, medium, easy. Okay, good, right? So that's what I wanted to cover today. We've got the first of these accidents of the parts of speech. We talked about number and we talked about case. Next week, we'll keep going. We'll look at the next one. Let's see what it is. The next one, after we do case, we do gender. Okay, so next week we'll talk about gender, all right? We'll talk about how we identify the genders of different words and how we translate them and why some words have genders that aren't even living things. Why would they have gender? We'll talk about that. So we'll deal with that next week. Okay. All right. Before we wrap up, let me just say a couple things before we wrap up. First of all, I know you guys get in here and you like to chit chat a little bit. Like right now, you're chit chatting about where do you live, blah blah blah, right? That's fine, but I want you to know that if you don't know already, I just created a new forum that you guys can use where you can get on the forum and chat with each other, get to know each other and stuff like that. So you don't have to do that during our meetings, right? You don't have to start asking each other what's your favorite vegetable and all this nonsense. You can do that on the forums. Okay. So if you want to create an account, you have to ask your parents, of course, but if your parents say that it's okay, you can create an account on the student forums and just get to know other students and chat with each other, students all over the place, all around the world. So if you'd like to chat, get on the forums. Okay. There's a place for you to do that. So I wanted you to know that. And again, before we leave, I want to remind you, when we go over these lessons together, take some time, go and now look at the Latin grammar lesson and read it for yourself, because it'll make clear sense and it'll help you to study through these lessons and get them done more easily. Okay, so that's all for today. We talked about numbers and cases and grammar. You're all free to go and have whatever fun you're planning to have today. Hopefully you'll try to make it to Stations of the Cross since it's Friday in Lent. But you're free to go now. And if anyone has any questions, we can hang out for a bit and I'll answer some questions. But usually, as soon as I say you're free to go, you all scatter like thieves into the darkness. So I doubt that there will be any questions. But if you have any, we can stay around and chat. So that's all for today. God bless everybody. Take care.